Hi, this is Wit, and in this video I'll be introducing the Uganda Affirmative for the DebateDrills Summer Intensive. To give a brief introduction to Uganda, Uganda is a country in the Great Lakes region of Eastern Africa that is landlocked and bordered by the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, Tanzania, and South Sudan. In the map you can see exactly where it's located in the eastern part of Africa. They were colonized by Britain in the 1860s and gained independence, to some degree at least, in 1962. Uganda is led by Yoweri Museveni, who is the current president of Uganda and has been since 1986. Uganda is considered by most observers to be highly corrupt. Uh, Key military leaders are appointed to high up positions that are expressly intended to support Museveni rather than supporting the country of Uganda. Having these military leaders tied to a certain individual rather than the government and country writ large is called military personalization. He's abolished term limits to allow him to stay in office indefinitely and appointed family members like his wife and son to key positions such that they can succeed him in the case that he dies or is removed from office. He's very repressive of opposition and human rights. He's arrested political opponents who oppose him both electorally and just activists that oppose his rule. He made a law that outlawed homosexuality with a penalty of death, and has recently gained notoriety for arresting a popular opponent of him that was a singer twice, simply for campaigning against him and bringing light to his human rights abuses. In recent years, Uganda has been the site of a number of important geopolitical and internal developments that help understand military aid, as well as the role that Uganda plays within the Great Lakes region. The first, which you may have heard of from things like Kony 2012, is the LRA. The LRA is the Lord's Resistance Army, which is led by Joseph Kony. It's an extremist terrorist Christian group that has caused massive human rights violations, including human trafficking, child soldiers, etc. Um, Through things like fighting, they're a rebel group that aims to impose Christian rule within Uganda, as well as other more nebulous claims like implementing multi party democracy. While these are the stated goals, it largely functions as a cult of personality behind Joseph Kony himself. Uh, Recently, the U.S. sent forces to help contain the LRA due to the success of such missions that were led by both the United States and Uganda. It has been largely contained at this point, and it's not much of a threat. But a lot of the military aid that is sent to Uganda is sort of a relic of our efforts to fight the LRA within Uganda because of the human rights violations they are creating. A more important threat that Uganda is engaged in right now is Al Shabaab. There is an Islamist fundamentalist group with a pledge to allegiance to Al Qaeda. Their main site of operation is Somalia, where for a while they largely controlled the entirety of the government. Recently, they have lost some ground due to AMISOM, which is the American, Ugandan, as well as a number of other international countries' mission in Somalia, where they've carried out missions to attempt to reduce their control. Uh, they have lost some ground, uh, but have carried out numerous attacks recently and still control large swaths of rural land within Somalia. Because Uganda is such a central player in the fight against Somalia and is in proximity, a lot of the U.S. aid that is given to Uganda is for the express purpose of fighting Al Shabaab and for helping support the missions they're carrying out. Another thing that you might come across when reading the evidence for the staff is AFRICOM. Africa is the United States Africa Command, which is responsible for military operations in all 53 African countries. Military aid to Uganda largely is distributed through this, and assistance is carried out in cooperation with AFRICOM in a large number of cases. Now I'll go on to discussing the advantages of the case and what you should be claiming offense for. The first advantage in the case is repression. I think I've covered in previous slides a lot of the instances of this crackdown of opposition, shooting of protesters, arrest of political opponents, etc. All of these have a substantial tie to military aid. Not only are many of the weapons being used to carry this out, military aid is also strengthening police and military forces that are the ones that are closely tied to Museveni and ensuring that he stays in power through all of these repressive tactics. Military aid is under far less scrutiny than other aid, like economic aid, which tends to go through NGOs and other nonprofits that try to ensure accountability. Military, on the other hand, is easy for Museveni to divert or simply repurpose. Things like training and weapons all have dual uses in that they can carry out things like missions in Somalia, yet also be, as they have in the past, used and deployed against protesters. Some of the evidence in the AF discusses how the very tanks that are on the ground trying to break up protests are ones the US gave Uganda. It also does things like cohere the United States to their government, which makes us less likely to criticize them. Because we're reliant on them for things like counter-terror operations, we're less likely to criticize them and try to influence their behavior or condemn them because we're perceived as an ally and it reflects poorly on the United States. You would argue the plan resolves this because Museveni would now risk sanctions because he no longer has the same ties, can't access weapons, and has to be more constrained in his approaches in general because he no longer has the backing of a superpower to keep him in power. You can go for this as a structural impact, as something that causes mass amounts of political oppression within Uganda that significantly diminishes the quality of life of tons of people. And you can weigh this against a lot of impacts the negative goes for as sort of ignoring the real reasons of instability and the unstable state of Uganda, which a lot goes directly back to Museveni. The second contention in this affirmative is adventurism. Adventurism generally refers to an aggressive propensity for military aggression or operations by a leader or country. In this case, the argument is that Museveni is currently engaged in a dangerous foreign policy that engages in a number of military conflicts that are unnecessary and create tension and risks within the region. They're currently building up tensions in the DRC and Rwanda. Uganda invaded the Democratic Republic of Congo recently to fight a Ugandan rebel group, which has justifiably made other states in the region worried about Ugandan intervention. Historically, Uganda has been a very aggressive militaristic country who have been responsible for over 5 million deaths in wars they've started recently. The solvency claims for this advantage are somewhat similar. Without the United States supporting counter-terror operations of their military, they'd be much more constrained and have to pick battles wisely instead of basically having no leash at all. When we consistently funnel Uganda military equipment because when theirs goes, out of style or is no longer functional, that essentially tells Museveni he can do whatever he wants with them and engage in missions across the continent with basically no repercussions because if he gets into trouble, the United States will back him up. This is a larger impact. You can both make escalation claims about how it leads to other powers getting drawn in, as well as the sheer magnitude of the deaths, and make sort of epistemological claims for how people systematically ignore deaths in Africa, despite the fact that over 90% of deaths in war happen in Africa. The next thing I'll cover is negative positions. The first being the demining counterplan. Demining refers to the process of removing mines, which are weapons that detonate when someone is in close proximity to them. These can be extremely harmful, both in the casualties they cause, people dying, losing limbs, but also the human cost. Many have to forego attending school or walking to obtain things like food and water because the risk of mines functionally forces people in mine-prone regions to stay inside or else risk simply coming across them as aftermath of which are simply in Uganda as a result of different wars and operations that have simply been abandoned because it's impossible to fully demine effectively after a war. The counterplan talks about ending all aid except a certain form we give to countries under NADR, which is non-proliferation, anti-terrorism, demining, and related programs, that is arguably military aid. The competition evidence, which is in the files you've given, as well as the ones the affirmative has to respond to, go a little more in depth into the debate whether demining is actually military aid and whether other alternative forms of demining aid are more effective. This counterplan is strategic because you can avoid a lot of impacts that have to do with forms of aid that are much more offensive and engaged in military operations, whereas demining is much more humanitarian and focused on removing the aftermath of war rather than helping cause more or enabling aggression. It's much harder for Museveni to repurpose mine equipment in order to engage in military adventurism than something like guns and ammo, which the counterplan would end. When entering demining, there are two angles that are not mutually exclusive in which you can take. First is the permutation. The permutation would argue that demining aid is not military aid, and therefore there's no reason for why giving demining aid is in any way competitive with ending military aid. A lot of evidence that is in the front lines describes why demining is actually closer to humanitarian aid or economic aid than something that is really military aid, because it's not done for the purpose of military operations and other things like that. It gets into a deep definition debate that is worthwhile to read evidence for and best understand. Something that will come up in these debates is the U.S. Green Book, which is the United States listing of different types of aid it gives to countries. It's actually inconsistent. Some years describing demining as military aid, some defining it as economic, without super clear delineations. So knowing the evidence best and being able to explain the definitions of military aid, demining aid, as well as economic aid is crucial to winning this debate. The second angle is winning a solvency deficit. This can take multiple forms. First is repurposing equipment. There are certainly some aspects, like mine-resistant vehicles, that can be repurposed into weapons of war, if not simply things that support military operations. Giving Museveni demining equipment is certainly something that could hypothetically be used as both an encouragement of his government and viewed as the U.S. giving legitimacy to it, which would have the same issues as the sort of coherent the United States to Uganda offense that was talked about on both advantages. He can also move aid to other things. For example, if we give money to give to demining, there are some cases in which Museveni has actually taken money that was meant for one thing and used it for something completely different. This is why it's important to, in CX, lock down exactly what the negative defends. And if they're too close and small, then you can argue that they don't really solve demining to any significant degree at all. Or, if it's too large, you can argue that it links to a lot of these solvency deficits. You also want to mitigate the impact substantially, and there is evidence provided to you that details how the amount of mines in Uganda is either non-existent or very small, in which case the risk of these solvency deficits would be pretty large compared to the amount of solvency the negative gets. The next disad I'll talk about, which is relatively easy to understand, is the terrorism disad. The vast majority of our military that goes to Uganda is for the purpose of supporting counter-terror operations in places like Somalia. The disad argues that this military aid is crucial because Uganda is a key counterterrorism partner. They're one of the few countries in the region that is most effective, according to some evidence. And Al-Shabaab, and as well as ISIS, have gained an increased foothold recently in certain regions in Somalia. And completely withdrawing military aid as the disad would argue that completely withdrawing military aid would just allow them to go unfettered with very little support, which would cause Somalia to become a failed or rogue state that is entirely run by terrorists again, which causes major proliferation risks, as well as increases their capacity to get things like nuclear weaponry or even have international influence, which risks things like nuclear war, extinction, etc., all of which are very bad. To enter the terror DA, there are a few different things you'll want to try to win. First is some defense. Easy ways to do this is to sort of point out holes in the actual threat that Al-Shabaab holds. There's evidence you have, and you should read through, that talks about how they're not really interested much at all in nuclear terrorism, and even if they were, nuclear terror is near impossible because of the massive hurdles it would take for a country, for a government or a group like Al-Shabaab or ISIS to actually get access to things like fissile material, facilities, launch equipment, etc., all of which are extremely restricted, highly monitored by international agencies, and no country really has any incentive whatsoever to give it to them. You'd also want to argue that the counter-terror assistance is ineffective and increases hostilities. And doesn't actually do much in the grand scheme of things. Even if Uganda is effective, tons of other countries are, and the US alone is, which means that it might not even be necessary for Uganda, even if counter-terror operations are good. In terms of link turns, you'll want to argue about how our military aid to Uganda actually fuels terrorism. There's evidence that talks about how military operations increase civilian hostility because it's perceived as Western aggression, which empowers terrorist groups. Uh, Forces in ANISOM have committed atrocities historically and do things like smuggling within Somalia that actually benefit al-Shabaab rather than hurt them. Al-Shabaab has historically framed themselves as a choice between them and U.S. intervention, which many people in the Middle East are justifiably worried about. Which means that you can argue that only pulling out military aid and sending a strong signal that the United States is allowing the Middle East to take its own path would actually increase the capacity for both democratic governance and for combating terrorist groups. The final position I'll cover is the SSR conditions counterplan. In terms of what SSR is, SSR stands for Security Sector Reform, which is a set of policies that don't have any specific set, but refers to a general group that aim at improving the military and police parts of governments in order to become less personalized and tied to individual leaders, and more committed to constitutional governance that respects rights, doesn't engage in human rights violations, etc. The counterplan would condition aid on reforming the military's practices to become independent and responsible. The argument for this is fairly simple. Without U.S. support, you would argue that we have basically no ability to change the behavior of Museveni. It's best to use our aid as leverage rather than just quitting totally, which would cause them to possibly act worse, and take away other existing constraints, which would increase the magnitude of all the app's advantages, as well as possibly destabilize the region and create a power vacuum that can lead to great power wars and possibly even extinction. In terms of competition, you'll want to win say yes, meaning that Museveni would actually agree to security sector reform, in which case the aid would continue, which is obviously mutually exclusive, with aid being completely ended. This is useful because it means that there's a very clear competition argument. If you don't win that, it relies on you winning certain definitions of words like should and ought, as well as other things that say that competing on certainty, i.e., it's not guaranteed that any one thing will happen, is valid. This will probably go more in depth if you take advanced util instruction, but keep in mind that simply winning that they say yes or no is alone not enough to win if the affirmative makes the right arguments. To answer the conditions counterplan, there's a set of arguments that are effective to help explain why the seemingly intuitive sounding scenario of it is less certain than it sounds. The first is rallying effects. Conditions would, you argue, empower Museveni and cause domestic backlash. People, as I talked about in the Terror DA, are very skeptical of U.S. intervention. And it would hypothetically cause domestic backlash if we were to say you must do exactly as we want in your government, and would make people more likely to support him and his repressive policies than less. Other evidence also talks about Praetorian Guards, which are military leaders that are highly tied to him and are willing to protect him, which means that continuing military assistance would mean that the people who have veto power on those reforms, i.e. high-up military officials, would just ignore it or have a functional veto on it, which would mean that the conditions don't work, and it would just cause more of the same, and cause all of the app's harms. There are also verification issues. It's extremely hard to verify that aid is being used responsibly because many of these operations are in remote places the U.S. doesn't have a direct presence in, which means it's hard to track these rights violations as well as adventurism. There's also a history of the U.S. not enforcing military aid conditions. Things like the Leahy Law, which say that we cannot give aid to countries with human rights issues, are pretty widely flouted. And so there's a compelling case that if the U.S. views Uganda as essential, even if it's not, then they'll just continue to give aid regardless of the conditions. Therefore, only mandating that there is an absolute end to aid is sufficient. The final one is that Museveni has historically engaged in threat construction and misled U.S. foreign policy establishment into thinking threats exist that aren't by inflating terrorist threats such that he can receive weapons. It's very possible that he would continue to do this and lie to the government, which they wouldn't be able to know, and to have historically been very gullible to, which would increase the risk of uh, harm and military aid continuing, despite the fact that these conditions in theory exist. There are also other angles, like reading theory arguments about the unpredictability of conditions counterplans, that can be very effective at pushing back on a lot of this. And that's something you should definitely be exploring and trying out different strategies in response to all of these positions. That covers the majority of what you need to know for the Uganda have to start. Please feel free to ask questions in Slack if you have any other questions, and make sure to be reading the evidence provided in all the files in order to best understand.